I've said a lot on this channel in the past that the French don't use nous in everyday French. Instead, they use on. But that doesn't mean that nous is never used at all. So in this video, we're going to talk about all the different ways that nous is used in the French language, as well as more on on versus nous. Donc, si vous êtes prêts, allez, c'est parti. Just before we do, I'd like to take a moment to talk to you if you are a foreigner living in a francophone country, particularly if you're frustrated about your speaking ability in the French language. And that's because my 8-week group program is specifically designed for English speakers living in a French-speaking land. I've taken the last 5 years of my experience learning French and living in France and condensed it down into an 8-week program where I teach you the skills, habits and mindset shifts you need to speak this language with confidence for your life, wherever you've chosen to call chez toi. The program is running at the moment and we have people from across France and Luxembourg taking part. Over on my website, if you're interested in checking out more information, you'll find videos and testimonials from both past and present students of mine to give yourself an idea of what you might learn and achieve during the 8 weeks together. And then if you think this might be the program for you, you can add your name to the waiting list absolutely free and be one of the first people to find out when the doors are going to be slamming open again. A link to that is down in the description. But now let's get back to the video you actually came here for. So that line that you've heard me say several times before on the channel, or perhaps it's your first time, use on instead of nous in your everyday French conversations. Perhaps that's controversial, but hear me out briefly. Whether you're someone who struggles to get all those conjugations in your head, or you're someone who simply wants to sound more natural when you speak, this is one of the easiest ways to go about it. Whenever you think of saying oui in French, use on instead of nous. So it's true, the French use on way more than they use nous, but this is in one specific, albeit very, very widely used case, and that is when we're talking about the subject pronouns nous and on. When you want to say oui, that is the subject pronoun in English, the equivalent of that grammatically in French is nous, but in everyday French they use on.
Bon, on va peut-être faire une photo générale, plutôt dans ce sens-là.
So, if you want to sound more like the natives when you speak French, there's no more nous allons à la plage, but only on va à la plage.
Normalement, on devait faire une petite activité poney. Mais, forte chaleur, le transport, donc on a modifié le truc. On a envoyé un message à tout le monde en disant « Venez avec un maillot de bain ».
It's something you can do from the moment you start writing or speaking the language. Just switch out one subject pronoun with its conjugations for another. I like how this French internaut puts it online. On as a first person plural subject has almost replaced nous in everyday conversation. But the more formal the context is, the more you'll hear nous. One thing is though that even when we're using on for we, if there are possessive articles involved, we still need to use those that usually correspond with nous rather than those that correspond with on. Let's just give you an example to make it crystal clear. Instead of on va à la plage et on prend ses lunettes de soleil, when we're using on for we have to say on va à la plage et on prend nos lunettes de soleil. On is simply a shortcut for saying we in French. And as our French friend said earlier, the more formal the context, the more we'll both hear and be expected to use nous. But for the vast majority of us learning to speak French at both the beginner and all the way through the intermediate level, most of the situations we're going to be in will require us to use more informal, more everyday French, which would mean we should use on instead of nous. And at the end of the day, we are all foreigners, so if we did make a mistake in the distinction between these two, we'd be forgiven. I should say that nous is used in literature. However, In literature, they also use the passé simple, which is a past tense that I've never learned. Why? Because at some point I realized that French is so complicated and I needed to focus on the French that was going to be needed for my everyday life. Passé composé does not come up in my everyday life, so I never studied it. I needed to play the odds, and that meant simplifying nuanced things like nous versus on. And overall, on wins by a mile based on how often it's used. So to close off this first part, a quick way to remember whether to use on or nous is to ask yourself, am I saying we in English and I want to use that in French, or am I saying us in English and I want to say that in French? If you're saying we, you need to use on, and if you're saying us, you need to use nous. And we're going to look more into what I mean by us in the next section. So let's look at the other ways nous is used in everyday French. Grammatically speaking, there are 4 of them, or 3.5 depending how you look at things. Nous is either a direct object pronoun replacing a direct object, or COD in French. For example, in the sentence ils nous aiment, they love us, it's representing a direct object here. Nous is also used as an indirect object pronoun, replacing an indirect object, or COI in French. For example, in the sentence elle nous parle, she's speaking to us. Here, nous is representing an indirect object. Thirdly, or 2.5ly, is nous can be a second object pronoun which replaces a second object in a sentence. And now for me, this is basically an indirect object. The distinction is that it's called a COS, or a second object, when there's already an object in the sentence. For example, tu nous l'as acheté. Tu nous l'as acheté. You bought it for us. Here, nous is the second object in the sentence, so technically it's a COS, and that's why I call it thirdly or 2.5ly. And finally, nous can be a stressed pronoun, or a pronom tonique in French. Used as, for example, in this sentence, merci d'avoir partagé ça avec nous. Merci d'avoir partagé ça avec nous. In that sentence, the stressed pronoun nous was combined with the preposition avec, and depending on the verb and or the construction, whatever you want to say, you might need another preposition. For example, il compte sur nous. Il compte sur nous. Elle pense à nous. Elle pense à nous. Tout le monde est contre nous. Tout le monde est contre nous. If you're still getting comfortable with the structures in those previous examples, then carry on focusing on those. Those truly are the backbone of speaking good French. Carry on with the next points if you want to start refining your conversation skills and sound more natural. Stressed pronouns, and in this video we're talking about the stressed pronoun nous, but it works with all stressed pronouns, are used for emphasis. Now, emphasis is done a lot in English, but it's done in sometimes different ways in French, and the only way you really get comfortable with it is by trying it out, mimicking and paying attention. The French will often make 2 references to the same person in their sentence, either at the beginning or at the end. Let's have a look at a couple of examples without nous so I can illustrate it, and then show you what happens in everyday French with the examples with nous. Qu'est-ce qu'il en pense, Félix? Qu'est-ce qu'il en pense, Félix? Here, Félix is the same as the subject referred as il in the sentence, but they're simply repeating it. Based on the context, Félix could also be the person that is being asked the question, so you just kind of got to figure that out from the context. Or if it's known from the context that Félix is the one whose opinion matters, then you might just replace Félix with lui and end up with qu'est-ce qu'il en pense lui? Qu'est-ce qu'il en pense lui? So lui here is the stress pronoun for him or he. So it represents him here. And in the response, you could also see the same thing, albeit at the beginning or at the end. It could be lui, il pense que ça craint. Lui, il pense que ça craint. Or even depending on the actual tone or whatever the person wants to put across, you might hear him say, Il pense que ça craint, lui. Il pense que ça craint, lui. Here's another with tu, and it's stressed pronoun toi. You might say, tu manges quoi, toi? Tu manges quoi, toi? The answer might be les restes, the leftovers. It's sort of similar to how in some parts of the UK or in other English-speaking countries you might say you lot or you guys, even though you've already mentioned you in the sentence. What are you up to, you guys? But at the same time, different. So the stressed pronoun usually corresponds with its grammatical equivalent, like tu with toi, je with moi, il with lui. But when we're talking about we take the stressed pronoun nous and pair it with the subject pronoun on, just like we do in the simpler sentences that I mentioned earlier on. For example, vous allez faire quoi ce soir? Vous allez faire quoi ce soir? Nous, on reste à la maison. Nous, on reste à la maison. In English, you might say us is a sort of surprised way just to check that they're asking about you. The French is not necessarily like that, although you could hear the same sort of thing. Nous? Generally, they just like to repeat themselves for emphasis. Nous, on reste à la maison. And like I said before, the stressed pronoun can be heard at the end of the sentence. On reste à la maison, nous. On reste à la maison, nous.
Qu'est-ce qu'on fait, quoi? Est-ce qu'on s'enferme? Est-ce qu'on vit? Nous, on a choisi de vivre. Nous, on a choisi de vivre.
Now, if you name two or more people of which one is you and you want to conjugate that to talk about an action, then it's perfectly acceptable to use the conjugation for nous. For example, toi et moi avons beaucoup de travail. Toi et moi avons beaucoup de travail. But again, it's far more common to use on here. To do this, you would repeat toi et moi, and then you sort of add a breath, a comma, essentially, and then say on and conjugate with on. So, toi et moi, on a beaucoup de travail. Toi et moi, on a beaucoup de travail. Once you start hearing this repetition of the subjects, it becomes far easier to accept and then reproduce yourself. I struggled more than usual to say that conjugation avant with the first example because I truly so rarely use nous in French. Voilà, c'est tout. If you want to say we in French, use on. If you want to say us, use nous, and just combine the two, and before you know it, you sound like a native. Hope you learned something in this video today. It's a simple and fantastically easy thing to put into place to stop using nous and start using on. I hope it all makes sense for you and you can go out there and start using it straight away and see value from it. One final plug for the group program. If you are an expat in a French-speaking country and want to banish the frustration that speaking French causes you, check out the link down in the description below and sign up for the waiting list. Like the video and subscribe if you're new around here, everyone. It helps me get the message out. New videos every single week. Thank you so much to my supporters here as members on the YouTube channel, as well as all my supporters over on Ko-fi.com. Your support makes these weekly videos possible. Thank you so much for joining me, everyone. Merci beaucoup d'avoir regardé. À la prochaine. Ciao.